I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'd like to talk about electional astrology. This is one of the four main branches of traditional astrology, and electional astrology is used for picking times to do things. So for example, if you want an auspicious time astrologically to get married, to start a business, or to file a lawsuit, then you would use electional astrology. So I've done this video because I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. This actually is an area, electional astrology, where there often can be a wide gulf between what clients are expecting and then what I'm actually able to provide to them. So I think it's very important to understand what is possible and what's not possible with electional astrology, and exactly what you'd be getting in analysis if you ordered from me. I think the first thing I'd like to talk about is what's really possible with elections. Okay? Because there's a hope that if I could just get the right time, that I can succeed at anything. And of course, that's not true. The election is just probably the smallest cycle of fate that we're dealing with. You have also your personal fate, the fate of your family, the fate of your city, your country, the economy, many, many variables that are coming into play. So one example I like to use is to say, well, if you had a good election and a good natal chart in Poland in 1939, you might get to be a refugee instead of being dead. And so you really need to be realistic about what's possible with an election. For example, if I chose a great time to run for president, it could be the greatest election of the century, and I'm still not going to be elected president. The odds are too high against me. And so we need to be realistic about what's possible, and then have an understanding of the practicalities of what we're trying to achieve as well. But it certainly is useful to elect a time. We want to go with the flow as much as we can, and that's certainly worthwhile. But again, we want to have a realistic idea of what's possible with elections. And so the next misunderstanding is that I'm going to provide you with a lucky day. And in fact, what you need to understand is that you're going to get a time range, because the astrological factors are changing over the course of a day. And so, it might be a good, 3 o'clock in the morning might be good, but then, 4:30 is actually terrible. And so, hopefully the time range isn't 5 minutes. I like to give more than that. So typically it's going to be like 30 minutes to an hour. But again, it depends on the chart and the circumstances. So then you're going to get a time range for a specific date for a specific location. So that means what I need from the client is your location, which would be your city and state or city and country. And then I also need to know what the date range is available. So for example, can we look over the next 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days? That's a typical sort of range that would be available. And then what days of the week are available. So for example, if it's filing a lawsuit, you need to go into court, it might only be open from Monday through Friday. And then finally, what times? So 9 to 5, Now the best for me would be any time, any day. I mean, that gives me a lot more opportunity, to look at days and times and astrological conditions. But we have to, again, be practical. So you want to artificially restrict it. At the same time, we have to be practical at what's actually possible. Obviously, again, you can't get married at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's really not practical. And really ideally, we would be looking at least 60 to 90 days. Now, I can look at a very small time range. If you said the best time tomorrow, I could certainly give you the best possible time tomorrow. It wouldn't necessarily objectively be a great time, but that brings up an important point. When we're doing electional astrology, in many cases, what we're doing is avoiding the really terrible times. I mean, we can't necessarily get the best election of the century, but we can avoid the really god-awful times that are popping up all over the place. And that's valuable as well. So what that also brings up is the fact that you need to be able to control the timing of the event. So for example, if you want to you've got a lawsuit and you can talk to the lawyer, if the lawyer's on board, you could have them file it at a particular time. If on the other hand you're trying to set the time for a hearing, then you're not going to be able to get the judge or the court to be able to set a specific hearing time for you. And so, for example, with surgeons, I do get a good number of requests for surgery elections. What you want to do is go to the surgeon and talk to their receptionist or secretary or who's ever setting their surgery days, and find out what days they have available and what times are available on those days, and then come to me with that information. And that's a better way of doing it than having me say, okay, 8:45 on Tuesday is good, and you go to the surgeon and say, oh, well, that's not available. So that's just a useful, practical approach. to that. And so how much control you have really determines the type of election that you get. Because what I do is I charge by the hour. And so you could get a half an hour election is the shortest, and that's usually 1 to 2 elections and costs $60. Now that's something you want to choose for something you can control. So for example, if you're submitting an application to get into a graduate school, you can take that application and you could walk it to the mailbox, or more typically nowadays you can go online. So if you have absolute control over it, then you don't need any more than a half an hour. Now, if you needed more elections, say 3 to 4, that's what you typically get for an hour, and that's $120. And now, if you have a situation like marriage, where there's caterers involved, where you have to hire a hall, it really does make sense to go ahead and get the hour election as opposed to coming back multiple times and having to hire me to do more times. Because it's important to remember that I'm going to work from the information you give me. So if you give me inaccurate information, or if it turns out that the caterer can't make it at that time, you're going to have to hire me to do another election. Okay? Because again, I'm charging by the hour, and you're the one who's controlling the information. So you have to make sure that that's accurate to the best of your knowledge. So it is possible for me to do emergency readings, and that's double price. And that means, so a half an hour election then would be $120, and I can do an emergency reading, typically in a day. Now you need to contact me and to find out what my schedule is, but that's how I can do it. Otherwise, basically, it takes me anywhere from 5 days to 10 days to get an election done, sometimes less, sometimes more. And if you want to find out what my schedule is, you can contact me and I can tell you approximately where I'm at. Now, you don't get the slot until you actually pay. When you actually do make the order, though, for the election, I can tell you exactly when I'm going to get it back to you. And I have to work on a first-come, first-served basis. Clients that came in first really deserve to have their readings done first, unless it's on an emergency basis. So let's talk about some other possible misunderstandings. I think the most important one is that I need to be able to be free to use my own methodology. If you think it's important to have certain astrological factors in the election, you're going to need to find that election yourself or find another astrologer. Because I've been doing this for 15 years as a professional astrologer. I have a methodology that's based on traditional astrology that works, that's been proven to be effective over time, and that's the one I can work with. And so I really am not able to, if someone comes in and says, oh, I don't want this particular, I don't want it to be, make sure Pluto's not in the 3rd house or something, I really need to be able to be free to work, to methods, because it's very hard to find elections. That's the trick. I mean, we can only control about 3 or 4 factors. And, if someone's coming in who doesn't really understand traditional astrology very well and insisting on certain factors, then that makes it difficult for me to get a good election. So I really need to be free to be able to do the election myself. And so basically what you're doing when you hire me is you're depending on my expertise and you're essentially putting yourself in my hands. So if you don't feel you can trust my methodology, and if you don't feel that you can put yourself in my hands, then it's probably best not to hire me to do an election. Because that's how I feel best to work. And from my standpoint, it's a bit like being a surgeon and having the patient sort of reach in and start trying to do the surgery themselves. I mean, it's too difficult to do and too complicated to try to put in these extraneous factors that I don't actually think are important. And so in this case, that's how I work. And so I think this comes about because a lot of the times that people are coming to do elections, they know a little bit about astrology. And what that means is modern natal astrology. And so that's a very different system. It has very different factors and very different imperatives from what I do. And also natal astrology is quite different from electional astrology. In natal astrology, you look at the entire chart. In electional astrology, only certain parts of the chart are significant. There's many, many differences. So that causes problems. Another problem is that people don't recognize that it's never possible to have a perfect election. Pluto or Saturn or whatever cannot be eliminated from the chart. They have to be somewhere. And so when we're working with, a limited number of days, which we almost always are, we have only so much to work with. And, the trick really, the real skill in electional is minimizing the negatives. They can never be entirely eliminated. So any chart you look at, you can always find something wrong with it. And so that causes problems as well, because people will get the chart, they immediately put it up and say, oh, well, I don't like 1, 2, I don't like these things in it. well, that's inevitable. And so again, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I certainly think it's worthwhile to do elections. And if I give you an election, I've checked it carefully, and I think it's worthwhile using. And certainly, if you get an election, you don't have to use it. But what I won't do is to argue about the elections. I won't just go into a long justification of why this is appropriate, and I won't redo elections for people that are dissatisfied. Again, like I said, I can't force you to use it, but if you hire me for an election, you basically need to be willing to accept the election that I provide for you. And, another misunderstanding that people have is that oftentimes people want an explanation. And what they're really actually ending up looking for is a full seminar in electional astrology. Now that, I do have a full course, but that takes a minimum of 6 months to train someone to do electional astrology. So what I've had to do basically is to say, look, I will give the astrological factors in my initial analysis, but that's as much detail as I'm going to go into it. Because basically, in too many times we get into arguments about, well, I don't like this factor, or why did you do this, or why did you do that? And again, the reason I've done it is because of my 15 years of study of traditional astrology. This has led me to believe these are the most important factors. And so it just really is counterproductive to get into too much detail in that situation. So again, you need to be willing to accept that if you're going to hire me to do an election. And so what I can do is certainly be of assistance in terms of the practical implementation of how to use this election, what's it best for. And so I think it's definitely worthwhile to do elections. And I use them for significant effects in my life. I don't do it for everything. Every time I walk out the door, I don't elect it astrologically. But I do think they're very worthwhile. And I'm happy to do elections for people and to do readings. But again, we need to be on the same page as far as what is going to be provided. So I hope this video has been helpful, sort of illuminating about electional astrology, and also will help clear up any misunderstandings that might take place before you might think of ordering an election. So if you need further information or further clarification about any of these policies, please contact me, and I look forward to having you as an electional client. Thank you very much.